"Ma'am, we ain't looking for trouble," the wounded cowboy rasped, blood seeping through his coat as a small girl clung to him in the frozen barn. Sarah Montgomery, a widow hardened by loss, stood in the howling blizzard of 1882 Blue Creek, her lantern casting shadows over a stranger and his daughter. Her solitary life, scarred by her husband's murder, was about to collide with a hidden truth that could reshape a corrupt town. Would Sarah risk everything for strangers who stirred her guarded heart? Unravel this tale of resilience and hope. Subscribe now. Share where you're listening from, and discover if courage can rebuild a broken home. What secrets lie in that barn? The wind screamed like a banshee across Blue Creek, tearing at the warped planks of Sarah Montgomery's cabin in the bitter winter of 1882. Snow stung her window panes, piling high against the sills, muffling the world to a ghostly hush. Sarah sat by the hearth, the fire's glow flickering across her calloused hands, a tin mug of coffee cooling on the table. Her rocker creaked, a rhythm she hadn't felt since Hank's death 3 years back, when bandits' bullets left her a widow on this unforgiving patch of dirt. The silence was heavy, thick with memories of a man who'd fought for their land and lost. She stirred the fire, sparks snapping like accusations. A sound cut through the storm's howl, not the groan of timbers or the wind's relentless wail, but something sharper, human. A cry, faint but desperate, from the direction of the horse barn. Sarah's eyes narrowed, her pulse quickening. Out here, 5 miles from the nearest soul, trouble didn't knock politely. She set the mug down, its clang swallowed by the storm, and reached for the Winchester propped by the door. Her fingers, steady from years of mending fences alone, curled around the cold steel. She didn't spook easily, but she wasn't fool enough to ignore her gut. Bundling her shawl tight, she lit a lantern, its flame dancing wild as she stepped into the blizzard. Snow bit her cheeks, clawing through her skirts as she trudged toward the barn, a crooked shadow against the swirling white. The door hung ajar, swaying with a groan that matched the wind's fury. She tightened her grip on the rifle, nudging the door wider with her boot. The lantern's light spilled inside, cutting through the dark like a blade. There, slumped against a hay bale, was a man, his coat soaked crimson where his hand pressed his side. His hat lay tipped in the straw, dusted with frost. Beside him, a girl, no older than 8, knelt, her small frame wrapped in a tattered shawl, clutching a shivering pup to her chest. Her eyes, wide but unyielding, locked onto Sarah's, not with fear, but with a defiance that hit like a punch. "Ma'am, we ain't looking for trouble," the man rasped, his voice raw as gravel. "Just needed out of the wind. We'll be gone by dawn." Sarah's finger hovered on the trigger, her gaze flicking between the man's bloodied side and the girl's steady stare. "You ain't going nowhere bleeding like that," she said, her tone flat but not unkind. She stepped closer, the lantern casting long shadows across the straw-strewn floor. The man's face was pale, etched with pain, but his eyes held a quiet strength, like a horse too stubborn to break. The girl, Maggie, shifted closer to him, her chin lifted despite the cold reddening her cheeks. "What's your name, girl?" Sarah asked, lowering the rifle an inch. "Maggie, ma'am," the girl answered, her voice small but clear. "This here's my pup. Ain't got a name yet." Sarah huffed, a cloud of breath in the frigid air. "And you, mister?" "Luther Dalton," he said after a pause, each word a labor. "Much obliged for the shelter." Names meant little out here. Truth was what carried weight. Sarah scanned the barn. Thin hay, cracked beams, the air sharp with frost. The storm wasn't easing, and neither was the churn in her chest. She'd buried Hank alone, faced winters alone, held this land alone. Strangers were a risk, but letting them freeze wasn't who she was. "I ain't got a spare room," she said, meeting Luther's gaze. "But the barn's got a roof. Don't bleed out on my floorboards." He nodded. Slow. Careful. "Obliged, ma'am." Sarah turned, her boots crunching through the snow, back to the cabin. The wind clawed at her, but her steps were slower now, her mind tangled. Inside, she ladled beans into a bowl, wrapped a heel of cornbread in a cloth, and grabbed a second lantern. The rifle stayed by the door this time. When she returned, Maggie stood guard by her father, her small hands clutching the pup like a lifeline. Sarah set the food on a crate, the lantern beside it, and left without a word. From her cabin window, she watched them. The lantern's glow painted the barn's walls, softening the harsh edges. Maggie tore the bread, sharing scraps with the pup, her frame curled against Luther's side. He leaned back, exhaustion carved into his face, but his hand never left her shoulder. Sarah's throat tightened. Hank had held her like that once, before the land and its cruelties took him. She drew the curtain, but sleep wouldn't come. The storm raged on, battering the shutters, and Sarah lay awake, listening for footsteps, for danger, for anything to justify the ache in her gut. It never came, but something else stirred, a flicker of something she hadn't felt since Hank's grave was fresh. Not hope, not yet, but the weight of a choice she hadn't made in years. As dawn crept over Blue Creek, the storm's fury dulled to a low moan, leaving a brittle crust of snow across Sarah Montgomery's land. The barn stood silent, its crooked silhouette etched against a sky the color of gunmetal. Inside her cabin, Sarah stirred a pot of oats, the steam curling like ghosts in the chill air. Her mind lingered on the strangers in her barn. Luther Dalton, bleeding and broken, and his girl, Maggie, with eyes too old for her 8 years. The weight of their presence pressed against her, not as a threat, but as a crack in the wall she'd built around her heart since Hank's death. The barn door creaked as Sarah pushed it open, a tin bucket of oats and a jug of water in her hands. The air inside was sharp, heavy with the scent of hay and blood. Luther sat propped against the same hay bale, his coat unbuttoned, revealing the crude bandage-soaked dark. Maggie knelt beside him, her small hands braiding straw into a lopsided crown for the pup, who gnawed at a stick. The girl's face lit up when she saw Sarah, but her smile was cautious, like a deer testing thin ice. "Morning," Sarah said, setting the bucket down. "Ain't much, but it'll keep you from starving." Luther's eyes, shadowed with pain, met hers. "Didn't expect this kindness, ma'am. We're in your debt." "Debt's a word that doesn't hold much out here," Sarah replied, her voice steady but not cold. "Eat. Then we'll see about that wound of yours." She crouched, inspecting Luther's side. The blood had slowed, but the gash was angry, red at the edges, promising trouble if left untended. Maggie watched, her fingers pausing in the straw. "Papa's tough," she said, more to herself than Sarah. "He always gets back up." Sarah's lips twitched, not quite a smile. "Tough doesn't mean invincible, girl." She fetched a clean cloth from her apron and poured water over it, dabbing at the wound. Luther tensed, but didn't flinch. His jaw set like a man used to swallowing pain. The barn's quiet was broken only by the pup's soft whines and the distant drip of melting snow. "You got a story, mister," Sarah said, not looking up. "Ain't nobody stumbles into my barn bleeding like this without one." Luther exhaled, slow and ragged. "Was riding to Blue Creek when trouble found us. Took a bullet meant for someone else. Maggie here. She's the reason I'm still breathing." His hand rested on the girl's head, her braids tangled from the night's ordeal. Sarah's hand stilled. She knew the weight of loss, the way it carved itself into your bones. Hank's face flashed in her mind, his laugh, his stubborn stand against the men who wanted their land. She shook it off, focusing on the cloth, now stained red. "Who's got a bullet with your name on it?" she asked, her tone sharp enough to cut through the haze of his words. Luther's gaze flickered, not with fear, but with something heavier: secrets. "Men who don't take kindly to change," he said. "That's all I'll say for now." Sarah didn't press. Out here, truth came slow, like water from a rusted pump. She tied a fresh bandage around his side, her fingers deft from years of patching up her own wounds, some on the skin, some deeper. Maggie handed her a strip of torn shawl to secure it, her small gesture carrying more weight than words. Outside, the snow had settled, blanketing the world in a deceptive calm. Sarah stepped to the barn door, scanning the horizon. Tracks crisscrossed the yard. Hers, but others too, faint and half-buried. Her grip tightened on the bucket's handle. Blue Creek wasn't a forgiving place, and strangers drew eyes like vultures to carry on. She'd heard the whispers in town before, about her, the widow who wouldn't bend. Now, with Luther and Maggie here, those whispers would sharpen into something uglier. Back inside, Maggie had coaxed the pup onto her lap, humming a tune that felt out of place in the barn's grim air. "He likes you," she said, glancing at Sarah. "Don't nobody else feeds him like this." Sarah's chest tightened. The girl's trust was a blade, cutting through the armor she'd worn since Hank's grave. "Keep him close," she said, her voice softer than she meant. "World's hard on strays." Luther watched her, his eyes searching, like he saw the cracks she hid. "You don't have to do this, ma'am. We'll move on as soon as I can stand." "You won't stand long with that hole in you," Sarah said, turning away. "Rest. I ain't decided what to do with you yet." She left them with the oats and water, her boots crunching back to the cabin. The air felt different now, charged, like the moment before a lightning strike. Sarah didn't look back, but she felt their presence in the barn, a tether pulling at her solitude. She'd spent years guarding this land alone, but something about that girl's hum, that man's quiet strength, stirred a question she wasn't ready to answer. What did it mean to open a door you'd long kept shut? The question lingered in Sarah Montgomery's mind, like dust settling after a stampede. What did it mean to let strangers past a door she'd barred for years? By mid-morning, Blue Creek's frost-crusted fields glittered under a weak sun, the air sharp as a blade's edge. Sarah stood at her cabin's threshold, her hands gripping a feed sack, eyes fixed on the barn, where Luther Dalton and his daughter Maggie sheltered. The weight of their presence gnawed at her, not as danger, but as a challenge to the solitude she'd worn like armor since Hank's blood soaked this land. She crossed the yard, her boots snapping brittle grass, the sack heavy with grain for her hens. The barn's shadow loomed, its silence louder than the storm that had brought them. Inside, Maggie knelt by the chicken coop, her small hands scattering feed, the pup yipping at her heels. Luther leaned against a post, his face gray but steadier, testing his weight on a makeshift crutch from a broken plank. Sarah's gaze flicked to the bandage on his side, cleaner now, but still a grim reminder of trouble trailing him. "You're upright," she said, setting the sack down. "Didn't expect that so soon." "Got no choice," Luther replied, his voice rough but firm. "Maggie needs me on my feet." Sarah nodded, her eyes on Maggie, who whispered to the hens like they were old friends. The girl's braids swung as she moved, her threadbare dress catching on a splintered board. Something in Sarah's chest shifted, like a stone dislodged from a riverbed. She remembered Hank mending that same coop, his laugh filling the air before bullets silenced it. She shook the memory off, focusing on the present. Maggie glanced up, her eyes bright. "You're chickens like me, Miss Sarah. They ain't pecked once." "Chickens know a kind hand," Sarah said, her tone softer than she intended. She handed Maggie a small knife to cut twine from the sack. "Mind the blade. It's sharper than it looks." The girl took it with care, her fingers steady despite her youth. Luther watched, his expression unreadable but heavy, like a man carrying more than a bullet wound. Sarah caught his gaze. "You're holding back, mister. Ain't just a stray bullet brought you here." Luther's jaw tightened, his eyes scanning the barn's rafters, as if answers hid there. "Some fights follow a man, no matter how far he rides. I didn't mean to bring 'em to your door." Sarah crossed her arms, the wind tugging at her shawl. "My door's seen worse, but I don't take kindly to half-truths on my land." He met her stare, something raw flickering in his eyes. "Fair enough. I'll tell you when the time's right. For now, no, I ain't here to cause you grief." Sarah let it lie, but the air felt charged, like the moment before a storm breaks. She turned to the coop, helping Maggie scatter feed, their hands brushing in the dust. The girl's quiet hum stirred memories of a life Sarah had buried, days when this land felt like home, not a battlefield. She straightened, brushing dirt from her skirt, and noticed a fresh notch on the barn's doorframe, carved clean and deliberate. Not hers. Not Luther's. Her pulse quickened. "Someone's been sniffing around," she said, her voice low, nodding at the mark. Luther hobbled over, his crutch scraping the dirt, and studied it. His face hardened, but he said nothing, only nodded. Maggie, oblivious, tossed a handful of grain, giggling as a hen darted forward. "Miss Sarah, you ever tell stories to your chickens? Papa says stories keep 'em laying eggs." Sarah's lips twitched. "Ain't much for stories, but I reckon you could teach me a thing or two." She paused, her gaze softening. "Folks, if you're listening to this tale unfold, I hope you're finding a spark of Blue Creek's grit in it. Subscribe to the channel to keep up with Sarah, Luther, and Maggie's fight. It's a story built on real hearts, and we'd love to know where you're hearing it from. Share it in the comments, and let's keep this fire burning." The moment passed, but the notch lingered in Sarah's mind, a warning etched in wood. She led Maggie to the mule's stall, showing her how to check its hooves for stones. The girl listened, eager, her small hands mimicking Sarah's motions. Luther followed slowly, his crutch steady but his eyes scanning the yard beyond the barn. Sarah noticed her own senses sharpening. Blue Creek's townsfolk weren't strangers to her. They'd turned their backs when Hank died, leaving her to face the grief alone. Now, with strangers under her roof, she felt their eyes again, sharper, hungrier. By noon, Maggie had taken to brushing the mule, her hum drifting through the barn. Sarah watched from the doorway, the feed sack empty at her feet. Luther joined her, his shadow long and uneven. "You're good with her," he said quietly. "She doesn't trust easily." "Neither do I," Sarah replied, her voice low but not harsh. "But that girl's got a way of sneaking past walls." Luther's lips curved, a ghost of a smile. "She's got her ma's heart. Lost her a year back. Fever took her quickly." Sarah's throat tightened. She knew that kind of loss, the kind that left holes no time could fill. "Hank went fighting," she said, her words clipped. "Didn't make it easier." They stood in silence, the barn's air thick with unspoken grief. Outside, the sun climbed higher, melting frost into mud. But the chill in Sarah's bones didn't fade. The notch on the doorframe, the tracks she'd seen yesterday, they weren't accidents. Someone was watching, waiting. She glanced at Maggie, now laughing as the pup chased a stray feather. For the first time since Hank's grave, Sarah felt a pull, not just to survive, but to protect something fragile, something worth keeping. The pull to protect something fragile, something worth keeping, settled in Sarah Montgomery's bones like the ache of an old wound. By late afternoon, Blue Creek's sun hung low, painting the fields in a bruised gold that made the land look more alive than it had any right to be. Sarah stood at the barn's edge, her hands dusty from mending a fence post Maggie had tried to climb. The girl's laughter still echoed in her ears, but it was Luther Dalton's shadow, cast long and uneven across the yard, that held her attention now. His secrets, half spoken in the barn's dim light, were a weight she couldn't ignore. Inside the cabin, Sarah set a kettle to boil, the hiss of steam mingling with the crackle of the hearth. Luther sat on a stool by the fire, his crutch propped against the wall, his face etched with lines deeper than the pain of his wound. Maggie was outside, tossing a stick for the pup, her small figure a speck against the vastness of the plains. Sarah had insisted Luther come inside to change his bandage. His fever was climbing, and she wasn't about to let him die on her watch. She knelt beside him, peeling back the cloth to reveal the wound, now hot and swollen, the skin around it angry as a rattler's bite. "This ain't healing right," she said, her voice low, steady. She soaked a rag in boiled water and pressed it to his side, ignoring his sharp intake of breath. "You're gonna tell me what's chasing you, Luther? I ain't patching you up just to bury you." Luther's eyes, clouded with fever, met hers. "You're a stubborn woman, Sarah Montgomery." "Takes one to know one," she shot back, wringing out the rag. "Speak, or I'll let this fever have you." He leaned back, the stool creaking under his weight, and stared into the fire. The flames danced, throwing shadows across his face, carving it into something raw, almost broken. "I'm the governor's man," he said finally, his voice rough as gravel. "Sent to Blue Creek to clean out the rot. Men like Amos Crowley and his crew. They've been bleeding this town dry. False deeds, stolen cattle, taxes that never reach the state. I was meant to slip in quiet, set things right without a fuss." Sarah's hand stilled, the rag dripping onto the floorboards. "A politician," she said, her tone flat but edged with suspicion. "You don't look the type." "Ain't one," Luther replied, a bitter twist to his lips. "I'm a fixer. Was a marshal once, till I got tired of badges. The governor knew I'd do the job clean, no speeches. But Crowley's men got wind of me before I hit town, ambushed me on the North Trail. That bullet was their welcome." Sarah's jaw tightened. She knew Crowley's kind, men who owned Blue Creek's soul, who'd let Hank die for daring to stand against them. "You think you can fix a town that don't want fixing?" she asked, tying a fresh bandage with hands that didn't shake. Luther's gaze drifted to the window, where Maggie's silhouette darted across the yard. "Didn't have a choice. After Maggie's ma passed, this job was all I had left to give her, a chance at something better than running." Sarah stood, wiping her hands on her apron. The fire snapped, spitting embers that mirrored the spark in her chest. She'd heard promises like that before, Hank's promises, sworn under these same stars before his blood stained the dirt. "Promises don't stop bullets," she said, "and Blue Creek's got more guns than good intentions." Luther nodded, slow, like a man who'd seen too many graves. "I know, but I ain't running this time. Not from Crowley, not from his men." The air in the cabin grew heavy, thick with the weight of his words. Sarah crossed to the window, watching Maggie chase the pup, her laughter cutting through the dusk. The girl's joy was a fragile thing, like a seedling in rocky soil. Sarah's mind flashed to the notch on the barn door, the tracks in the snow, signs of eyes watching, waiting. Crowley's men weren't fools. They'd come for Luther, and maybe for her too. She turned back to him, her voice low. "You brought a war to my doorstep, Luther Dalton. If you're staying, you'd better be ready to fight it." He met her gaze, his eyes clearer now, despite the fever. I didn't mean to drag you into this, Sarah, but I reckon you've been fighting your own war a long time." She didn't answer, but his words hit like a stone through glass. She'd fought to keep this land, to keep herself whole after Hank's death, but it was a fight she'd waged alone. Now, with Luther's truth laid bare, the stakes felt different, sharper, heavier. Outside, Maggie's voice called to the pup, a bright note against the gathering dark. Sarah's hand rested on the windowsill, her fingers tracing the worn wood. She'd built walls to keep the world out, but somehow, this man and his girl had slipped through. The question wasn't whether she'd fight, it was whether she could stop. Whether Sarah Montgomery could stop fighting was a question that burned hotter than the embers in her hearth. But Blue Creek's dusk offered no answers, only shadows creeping longer across the frost-bitten fields. The next morning, the air bit sharp, the kind of cold that settled in your joints and stayed. Sarah stood on her porch, a tin mug steaming in her hands, her eyes tracing the horizon where the town's silhouette loomed like a vulture waiting to pick clean what was left of her peace. Luther's truth, that he was the governor's man sent to uproot Crowley's corruption, had shifted the ground beneath her. She'd kept her land through grit and silence, but now, with a wounded stranger and his girl under her roof, silence wasn't an option anymore. She crossed the yard to the barn, her boots crunching through a thin layer of ice. Maggie was there, perched on a crate, her small hands weaving a rope from straw to play with the pup, who yipped and tumbled in the dirt. Luther stood by the door, his crutch gone, testing his weight with a grimace. His wound was mending, but slowly, and the fever still clung to him like damp rot. Sarah handed him a bowl of cornmeal mush, her gaze catching on a new mark in the yard, a single boot print, deep and deliberate, near the water pump. It wasn't hers, nor Luther's. "Someone's circling," she said, her voice low, like the growl of a dog sensing a wolf. She pointed to the print, its edges sharp in the frozen mud. Luther's eyes narrowed, his hand instinctively dropping to his side, where a gun might have hung once. "They're getting bold," he muttered. Sarah's jaw tightened. She'd seen signs before. Hank had pointed them out too, before Crowley's men came for him. A broken fence, a missing hen, whispers in the mercantile that cut deeper than knives. Now, the signs were back, and they weren't subtle. She led Luther to the edge of the property, where a dead crow hung from a fence post, its neck twisted, pinned with a rusty nail. The message was clear as a gunshot. Leave, or worse. "Crowley's men," Luther said, his voice steady but heavy, like a man reading his own gravestone. "They don't want me in town, and they'll burn this place to make sure I don't stay." Sarah's fingers curled into fists, the cold biting her knuckles. "They ain't burning nothing," she said, her tone sharp as barbed wire. "This is my land. They took enough when they took Hank." Luther studied her, his eyes searching for cracks in her resolve. "You don't have to stand in this, Sarah. Maggie and I can ride out, draw their fire elsewhere." She turned on him, her gaze hard as flint. "You think running saves anyone? I stood quiet when they killed my husband. Watched this town turn its back while his blood soaked the dirt. I ain't standing quiet again." The air between them crackled, thick with the weight of their shared scars. Luther nodded, a slow dip of his head, like a man accepting a duel he knew he couldn't dodge. Maggie's voice broke the tension, calling from the barn. "Miss Sarah, the pup found something." Sarah and Luther crossed the yard, finding the girl holding a tattered scrap of cloth, stained dark and caught on a splintered board. It smelled of tobacco and sweat. Crowley's men, no doubt, marking their territory. Sarah's pulse thrummed, her senses sharpened by years of surviving alone. She scanned the fields, catching a glint of metal in the distance, a rifle barrel, maybe, or just the sun on a broken bottle. Either way, it set her nerves alight. "They're watching," she said, her voice low. "Ain't just passing through." Luther's hand clenched, his knuckles white. "They're testing us, seeing if we'll break." "Then they're fools," Sarah snapped, her eyes blazing. She marched to the cabin, fetching her Winchester from its place by the door. The weight of it steadied her, a reminder of the fights she'd won alone. But this time, she wasn't alone. Maggie trailed her, clutching the cloth like a trophy, her face a mix of fear and defiance. "They're mean, ain't they?" the girl asked, her voice small but steady. "Meaner than a cornered rattler," Sarah replied, checking the rifle's chamber. "But we're tougher." Luther followed, his steps uneven but deliberate. "I'll stand with you," he said, his voice low, carrying the weight of a vow. "But Crowley's men don't play clean. They'll hit hard, and soon." Sarah met his gaze, her resolve ironclad. "Let 'em come. I've held this land through worse." She handed Maggie a broom, pointing to the barn. "Sweep the floor, girl. Keep that pup close. We got work to do." As Maggie scampered off, Sarah and Luther stood shoulder to shoulder, the barn's shadow stretching across the yard like a warning. The wind carried the faint sound of hooves, distant but closing, a promise of trouble riding in. Sarah's grip on the rifle tightened, her heart pounding not with fear, but with a fire she hadn't felt since Hank's last stand. This wasn't just her land anymore. It was a line in the dirt, and she'd be damned if she let Crowley's men cross it. The line Sarah Montgomery drew in the dirt wasn't just for her land. It was a defiance against the ghosts of Blue Creek's past, a vow to hold fast where she'd once faltered. By noon, the sun burned through the morning's chill, casting a harsh light over the fields, where every shadow seemed to hide a threat. Sarah stood by the barn, her Winchester resting against her shoulder, her eyes scanning the horizon for the hoofbeats that had haunted the wind. Crowley's men were coming. She felt it in her bones, like the ache before a storm. Luther Dalton stood beside her, his wound still slowing him, but his gaze steady as iron. Maggie, oblivious to the tension, knelt in the dirt, planting marigold seeds in a cracked bucket. Her pup curled at her feet. Sarah's hands tightened on the rifle. She'd buried Hank for standing against Crowley's kind, and the town's silence had buried her spirit alongside him. But Maggie's quiet humming, the way Luther straightened a sagging gate without a word, had cracked open something she'd thought long dead. She wasn't just fighting for dirt anymore. She was fighting for the life she'd forgotten how to live. "Miss Sarah," Maggie called, holding up a dirt-streaked hand. "These flowers are gonna bloom bright, ain't they?" Sarah's lips twitched, a shadow of a smile. "If you keep 'em watered, they might outshine the sun, girl." She glanced at Luther, who was testing a loose fence post, his hand steady despite the pain etched in his face. "You're pushing too hard," she said, her voice low but firm. "That wound'll tear open again." Luther met her gaze, his eyes glinting with something fierce. "Can't sit idle when trouble's riding in. You know that better than most." She did. The dead crow, the boot print, the scrap of cloth. They weren't warnings anymore. They were promises. Sarah turned to the cabin, fetching a hammer and nails from the porch. "If they're coming, we'll make this place a fortress," she said, tossing Luther the hammer. "Start with the barn door. It's too weak." He caught it, nodding, and set to work, the rhythmic thud of hammer on wood echoing across the yard. Sarah joined Maggie, showing her how to shore up the chicken coop with old planks, their hands moving in tandem. The girl's chatter filled the air, stories of her ma's garden, of flowers that bloomed despite drought. Each word was a needle, stitching Sarah's resolve tighter. She'd let Hank's death silence her once. She wouldn't let it happen again. By dusk, the barn stood stronger, its door reinforced, the windows boarded save for narrow slits. Sarah's hands were splintered, her shoulders aching, but the work felt right, like reclaiming a piece of herself. She caught Luther watching her. His hammer paused mid-swing. "You're choosing a fight you don't owe," he said, his voice low, almost a warning. Sarah wiped sweat from her brow, her eyes hard as flint. "Ain't about owing. It's about what's right. That girl deserves better than running. So do you." Luther's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. He drove another nail, the sound sharp against the quiet. Maggie appeared, dragging a bucket of water for the marigolds, her face smudged, but determined. "Papa, you think Miss Sarah's flowers'll scare off the bad men?" she asked, half serious. Luther's lips curved, a rare softness breaking through. "Might just, Maggie. Ain't nothing fiercer than a woman's will." Sarah snorted, but her chest warmed. She led Maggie to the cabin, teaching her to stack firewood by the hearth, showing her how to bank the coals to last the night. The girl mimicked her, clumsy but earnest, her small hands learning the rhythm of survival. Outside, Luther finished the barn, his silhouette sharp against the fading light. Sarah watched him from the porch, the rifle at her side, her mind turning over his words from yesterday, about fighting a war she'd been waging alone. The air grew heavy, the kind of stillness that comes before a gunfight. Sarah's eyes caught a flicker in the distance, a shadow moving too quick to be a coyote. She signaled Luther, who dropped the hammer and stepped beside her, his hand hovering where a gun should be. "They're close," he whispered, his breath a cloud in the cooling air. Sarah's pulse thrummed, but her voice was steady. "Let 'em try. This land's seen blood before. It'll hold ours if it has to." Maggie appeared at the door, her eyes wide but not trembling. "Miss Sarah, you scared?" she asked, clutching the pup. "Scared's just a feeling," Sarah said, kneeling to meet her gaze. "We don't let it choose for us." She handed Maggie a lantern, its glow cutting through the dusk. "Keep this lit, girl. We'll need the light." As night fell, the fields grew silent, the stars sharp as knife points above Blue Creek. Sarah and Luther stood watch, their shadows blending into the barns. The fight was coming, and Sarah's choice was made, not just to survive, but to stand for something bigger than herself, for a girl who planted flowers and a man who carried a town's hope on his shoulders. Sarah Montgomery's choice to stand for something bigger than herself burned like a signal fire in her chest, its glow matching the lantern Maggie clutched as night swallowed Blue Creek. The stars above were cold, sharp as spurs, and the air held a stillness that felt like the world holding its breath. Sarah stood by the barn, her Winchester loaded and heavy in her hands, her eyes locked on the dark, where the fields met the horizon. Luther Dalton was at her side, his wound a dull ache he ignored, his borrowed revolver tucked into his belt. The barn, now fortified with boarded windows and a braced door, stood like a sentinel behind them. Inside, Maggie huddled with the pup, the lantern's light a faint beacon through the slits. The distant hoofbeats from dusk had grown louder, a low rumble that set Sarah's nerves alight. "They're here," Luther whispered, his voice steady as a drawn bowstring. He pointed to a flicker of movement, a shadow splitting from the darkness, then another. 3 riders, their silhouettes hunched against the night, crept closer, their horses' steps muffled by the frost-hardened earth. Sarah's grip tightened on the rifle, her breath a faint cloud in the chill. "Stay low," she hissed, dropping to a crouch behind a stack of firewood. Luther followed, his revolver glinting faintly as he checked its chambers. The riders halted at the edge of the property, their faces hidden under wide-brimmed hats. But Sarah knew Crowley's men by their swagger. Men who'd burned barns and broken men like Hank without a second thought. One rider dismounted, his boots thudding against the ground. He carried a torch, its flame licking the air, casting jagged shadows across the yard. "Dalton," he bellowed, his voice thick with menace. "We know you're in there. Come out, or this widow's land goes up in smoke." Sarah's blood ran hot, her jaw clenching. She glanced at Luther, whose eyes burned with a fire to match her own. "They ain't touching this place," she muttered, raising the Winchester to her shoulder. Her aim was steady, trained by years of hunting coyotes and surviving alone. "Cover the barn door," she told Luther. "They'll try to flank us." Luther nodded, slipping toward the barn's side, his steps silent despite his limp. Sarah peered through the firewood's gaps, her heart pounding but her hands calm. The torchbearer stepped closer, his flame held high, illuminating a scar across his cheek. Jeb Crowley, Amos's brother, a man who'd laughed when Hank bled out. Sarah's finger brushed the trigger, but she held back. Not yet. A second rider drew a pistol, firing a shot into the air, the crack splitting the night. "Last chance, Dalton!" Jeb shouted. "Bring the girl, or we burn it all!" Inside the barn, Maggie's lantern flickered, but her silhouette didn't waver. Sarah's chest tightened. She'd told the girl to stay put, to keep the light burning. Now, that light was a target. She signaled Luther, who crouched by the barn's corner, his revolver ready. The third rider circled wide, aiming for the back, just as Sarah had feared. She fired first, a single shot that kicked up dirt at Jeb's feet. He flinched, the torch swaying. "Next one's in your chest," Sarah called, her voice cutting through the dark like a blade. The riders froze, caught off guard by a woman's defiance. Luther seized the moment, firing at the circling rider, who yelped as his horse reared, bolting into the shadows. Jeb snarled, hurling the torch toward the barn. It landed short, sizzling in the frost, but the intent was clear. Sarah fired again, grazing his shoulder. He stumbled, cursing, as the second rider charged, his pistol flashing. Luther answered with 2 shots, one hitting the rider's leg, sending him sprawling into the dirt. The third rider, now spooked, turned tail, his horse's hooves fading into the night. Sarah sprang from cover, her rifle trained on Jeb, who clutched his shoulder, blood seeping through his fingers. "Drop it," she said, her voice cold as the frost beneath her boots. He hesitated, then let his pistol fall, his eyes blazing with hate. Luther emerged, his revolver still raised, his face pale but resolute. "This ain't over," Jeb spat, backing toward his horse. "Crowley'll bury you both." "Let him try," Sarah said, her aim unwavering. "Tell him this land doesn't bend." Jeb mounted and fled, leaving his fallen man groaning in the dirt. Sarah and Luther tied him to a post, his curses fading as they dragged him to the barn. Maggie appeared at the door, her eyes wide but dry, the lantern steady in her hands. "You scared him off, Miss Sarah," she said, her voice small but proud. Sarah lowered her rifle, her heart still racing. "For tonight," she said, meeting Luther's gaze. The fight had bought them time, but Crowley's shadow loomed larger than ever. They'd drawn blood, and Blue Creek would answer. Blue Creek's answer to the night's bloodshed wasn't thunder or fire, but a quiet shift, like the first thaw after a long winter. Dawn broke over Sarah Montgomery's land, the sun spilling gold across fields, scarred by hoofprints and gunfire. Sarah stood on her porch, her hands wrapped around a chipped mug, the steam curling like a prayer. The barn, battered but unbowed, stood as a testament to the fight she, Luther Dalton, and little Maggie had won. Crowley's men had fled, but their threat lingered, a shadow cast long over Blue Creek's heart. Sarah's eyes traced the horizon, where the town's rooftops glinted, no longer distant, but part of a fight she'd chosen. Inside, Luther cleaned his borrowed revolver, his movements slow but steady, the fever finally loosening its grip. Maggie sat cross-legged by the hearth, braiding a new leash for her pup, her marigolds blooming defiantly in their cracked bucket. Sarah's chest ached, not with grief, but with something fiercer: purpose. She'd held this land alone since Hank's death, but now, with Luther's quiet strength and Maggie's stubborn hope, solitude felt like a coat she'd outgrown. She stepped into the yard, her boots kicking up dust where blood had dried. "We ain't done," she said, glancing at Luther as he joined her, his hat pulled low. "Crowley's licking his wounds, but he'll come back meaner." Luther nodded, his eyes scanning the fields. "He will. But Blue Creek's waking up. Last night wasn't just our fight." Sarah's brow arched, skeptical but curious. She'd seen the town turn its back when Hank died, their silence louder than any gunshot. But as she looked toward Blue Creek, a rider approached. Not one of Crowley's, but Amos Hart, the sheriff, his duster flapping like a crow's wings. He dismounted, his face weathered but kind, his badge glinting in the morning light. "Sarah," he said, tipping his hat. "Heard about the ruckus. You all right?" "Still standing," she replied, her tone sharp but not hostile. "What's the town saying?" Amos shifted, his boots scuffing the dirt. "Folks are talking, not just about Crowley's men running scared, but about you and Dalton. Some say you're stirring trouble. Others, they're starting to listen." Sarah's jaw tightened. She'd faced whispers before, branding her a widow too stubborn to break. But Luther stepped forward, his voice low. "Steady. Let 'em talk. I came to fix what's broken. Last night was a start." Amos glanced at him, then at the barn, its fresh boards a silent testament. "Governor's letter came this morning. You're the mayor, Dalton, official. Crowley's out, but he won't go quiet." Sarah's eyes narrowed. "He never does. But this land's mine, and I ain't letting him claim it." Amos nodded, a spark of respect in his gaze. "You've got folks behind you, Sarah. Harlan at the feed store, Widow Bell, and even Old Man Walker. They're tired of Crowley's grip. Might be time to show 'em what Blue Creek can be." As Amos rode off, Sarah felt the weight of his words. She turned to Luther, who was watching Maggie chase the pup across the yard, her laughter bright against the morning's grit. "Mayor or not, you're staying here," Sarah said, her voice firm. "Ain't no fancy house in town gonna hold what we've built." Luther's lips twitched, a rare smile. "Wouldn't dream of it. This place, it's more home than I've had in years." By afternoon, the townsfolk began to arrive, not in droves, but in quiet steps. Harlan brought a sack of nails, his rough hands offering to mend the fence. Widow Bell carried a basket of apples, her eyes soft with a gratitude Sarah hadn't seen before. Old Man Walker, leaning on a cane, spoke of his son's hope for a fair town. They didn't say much, but their hands worked, stacking wood, patching the coop, planting seeds beside Maggie's marigolds. Blue Creek was stirring, not with speeches, but with the slow, stubborn work of people remembering how to stand together. Sarah watched from the porch, her rifle propped nearby, not for fear, but habit. Luther hammered a new hinge on the gate, his movements stronger now, each strike a promise. Maggie darted among the townsfolk, her pup trailing, her voice weaving stories of flowers and hope. Sarah's heart didn't ache anymore. It beat, steady and sure, like the land itself. As dusk settled, the fields glowed softly, the scars of battle fading into the earth. Sarah sat beside Luther on the porch, Maggie sprawled in the dirt, sketching shapes in the dust. "This ain't the end," Sarah said, her voice low, her eyes on the town's distant lights. "Crowley'll try again. Let him. Luther replied, his hand resting near hers, not touching, but close. We've got something he doesn't, a reason to stay. Maggie looked up, her face smudged but bright. Miss Sarah, we're home now, ain't we? Sarah's throat caught, but she nodded. Reckon we are, girl. Blue Creek wasn't just a town anymore. It was theirs, forged in dirt and defiance, a place where broken things could mend. The sun sets on Blue Creek, where Sarah, Luther, and Maggie forged a home from grit and defiance. Their tale of resilience and quiet victories echoes the heart of the West, where broken things mend through shared labor. What did their stand against Crowley's shadow stir in you? Share your thoughts below. We'd love to hear how this story landed. Gratitude for riding this trail with us, feeling the dust and hope of Blue Creek. Pull up a chair next time. Another tale's waiting, stitched with the same raw spirit. Until then, keep your fire burning and your heart open to the stories that shape us.